Here we are for, looking at my notes, the 14th session of Old Testament survey. And we're today going to do the book of Job, spelled J-O-B, and we pronounce it Job instead of Job, so that we'll know what we're talking about. I think the Hebrew has a kind of a long pronunciation, but in modern Hebrew it's pronounced Job, actually, but we say Job. Job is the first of the poetic books. If you have a regular copy of the Bible available, you'll see it's about halfway through. If you open your Bible right in half, you'll find the book of Psalms right there, and it doesn't show very well, but that's where Psalms is. And Job is the good-sized book that comes just before the book of Psalms. Job has 42 chapters. It's a long book, but what makes Job interesting, and the reason that I put it here in the study of Old Testament books, is that it was probably the first book of the Bible written, most likely written before Genesis. Now, there's a possibility that it was written sometime later, but I rather think that Job was written during the patriarchal era, during the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and those guys, sometime around 2,000 years before Christ. And that would put it 500 years before Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So Job fits about here in the overall narrative. Let me share the screen. And I kind of like this picture. So we'll share. This isn't Job, by the way. This is Job's camel. And this particular camel I shot in Jerusalem, no doubt. That's where we run into most of our camels when visiting Israel. The camels that you find in the wild are few and far between. There is a camel auction that happens every week, every Thursday morning in Beersheba in the Negev. Lots of tourists like to go to Beersheba to get in on the camel auction. But watch out for these guys. They may be kind of adorable, but they spit. They've got bad tempers, and they're pretty nasty characters. Now, one of the things that we notice about the story of Job is that Job has camels, among other things. And the camels that Job has are domesticated camels. They're camels that he uses for whatever. Maybe Job hires caravan drivers. I don't know what Job did with his camels. He also had sheep and goats and donkeys and miscellaneous other critters. Job was a pastoralist. He lived out in the desert, semi-desert. We know the location of Job's experiences, but we'll talk about some other things first. But let's do some introduction. As this book of Job is famous, it is universally acknowledged to be great literature. Everybody says that, whether they've read it or not. If you take a literature class in college somewhere, Job might be mentioned. When Donna and I were in college, we took a literature class in which we were required to write a paper about the book of Job. And that was a long time ago. How long ago was that? That was 50 years ago that we took that course. I wonder if they still do that. But anyway, the book of Job is anonymous. That means that it doesn't claim to have been written by anybody. Now, of course, somebody wrote it, but we actually, honest and truly, don't know who wrote this. The commentators disagree, which is what we pay them to do. Uh, some would say that Moses wrote it. I think that's probably not correct. Some would say that Solomon wrote it. And I also think that that is very unlikely. Uh, my reasons for that are technical. They have to do with the use of the language. Uh, it is possible that uh, somebody working at the time of Moses or Solomon rewrote and edited the book of Job. But I think the original work goes all the way back to the time of Job himself. Let me see here. I've got something here right in the way. Some other possibilities. Some commentators suggest that Ezra the scribe during the Babylonian captivity actually wrote the book. I think that's outlandish. That's far too late. And there's no other evidence to suggest that. And then the more likely candidates are Job himself, and a character who shows up just at the end of the dialogue portion of Job, which is the young theologian named Elihu. If Elihu is the author, then everything makes sense. So I rather like him as the author of the book, but of course we don't know, and whatever we do, we're guessing. Historically, this has to be dated during the patriarchal age. It just has to be. Job is making sacrifices for his children, for his family. These sacrifices are patriarchal. Job does the same kind of thing that Abraham or Isaac would do. Go to a place, build an altar, make a sacrifice. And the sacrifices were associated with a feast. This is exactly the sort of scene that we see during the life of Abraham and Isaac. The same thing is going on. So we'd say Job's sacrifices are patriarchal. The second clue here is that Job lives about 200 years. Now, after the flood, the lifespan of people decreased at a reverse exponential rate. It's a hyperbolic curve. And for those who've forgotten their high school geometry or wherever hyperbolics are brought up, that's a decay curve. If I don't. Am I visible? I'm not visible on any of these screens, so I'm not going to attempt to draw this. I'd have to show you a thing. But if Adam's lifespan was around 1,000 years, and Noah's lifespan was around 600 years, and Abraham's lifespan was around 200 years, and by the time we get to Joseph, we're around 120 years, you can see that the 200-year lifespan was something that only happened for a fairly brief period of human history. The flood changed everything about the human environment. People and animals lived a long time before that, and then after that time, the lifespan gradually lowered itself down, eventually to 70 years, which is the modern lifespan. But all of that happens as a result of gradual decay because the environment is under a curse in the form of the flood. Anyway, all of that aside, Job lived about 200 years. That puts him squarely in the middle of the patriarchal era. And then finally, there's a total lack of reference to Israel or anything Israeli. There's no mention of Egypt. There's no mention of the Exodus. There's no mention of the temple or the tabernacle or the various kinds of temple worship. None of it, nothing at all is there. And anybody who comes after the time of Moses would certainly be making references uh, to the temple and to the sacrificial system or to something related to Judaism. There's nothing there. There is also no mention at all of miracles, any kind of miracle. God's intervention is supernatural, of course, but not miraculous. There are none of the biblical miracles that we find from the time of Exodus on are mentioned. So Job is fairly early. Now, Job is also a Gentile. It's a very interesting location that we find Job in. It's a pastoral setting, meaning Job has flocks and herds, and he's out somewhere in grazing country. The location, this is demonstrated by a bunch of clues. My favorite clue to the location of the book of Job has to do with the fact that the cows are plowing. The cattle are being used, and not oxen, but cattle in Hebrew. Cows being used for plowing a field when some bad guys come and steal them all. The only place in the ancient world where we have any reference at all to cows doing the plowing is in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, the northwest section of Arabia, north of the area that we call the Yemen. Used to be North and South Yemen. Now it's just Yemen. In the ancient world, it was called Sheba. The Queen of Sheba comes from there. North of Sheba is an area we call the Hijaz, Hijaz. And Hijaz is the somewhat marginally fertile area that's the birthplace of Islam. So Mecca and Medina and some other famous places are in the Hijaz. It is possible for nomadic people to live there. The rest of the Arabian Peninsula, away from the coastline, is uninhabitable. People don't live out in the middle of the Great Arabian Desert. That's just too dry. It never rains, and nothing grows, and even animals die. The camels can cross around the edges of the desert because they need a watering stop every 50 miles or so. But they have to find oases, and those are around the edges. The Hijaz is a part of that edge of the desert, and we're quite sure that Job lived in that area. He's a rich and obviously pious Gentile. He knows God. He knows about sacrifice. He's a righteous man. The description of Job speaks of him as a godly, righteous, upstanding, honorable man. Everything that the Bible has to say about Job is very positive. And it's important to remember that Job fits into the larger context of, say, Melchizedek. Melchizedek was also a Gentile, a believer, a priest of God Most High. Job operates as a kind of priest. That's not his main emphasis. But Job fits under the overall rubric or outline in which we find Melchizedek, and later on Moses meets Jethro, a priest of Midian. The Midianites lived in this same general area. All of these people, Melchizedek, Job, and Jethro, were Gentile believers who had responded to the grace of God shown to them in general revelation. Now, I don't think anyone is saved without the grace of God, but I believe looking at these examples, then people are saved without an explicit and detailed knowledge of the gospel. So Melchizedek is a type of Christ. He looks forward, but there's so little that we know there. Jethro is obviously a believer, and he understands a great deal about how Israel was brought out. Job seems to have a great deal of knowledge. In one place he says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the last days he will stand upon the earth. Job even has a belief in his own resurrection. I don't know where he gets all of this. Some of what Job is looking forward to has to have come down, has to have been passed down from Adam, and from Adam through Noah. So there is a what I would call an oral tradition component of general revelation. Much of the time we're tempted to say that general revelation just means the rocks and stars and trees and birds and stuff, and we should learn by studying science. I think that there's more than that, and that there are cultural traditions that are handed down through the generations that are also valuable. And our study of those traditions is just as important if we're to understand what ancient people actually know, and in modern times, what primitive people still know that can be the key to reaching them. Missionaries study that, and it's important. Okay, so the date, probably 2,000 years before Christ in Arabia, way out in the desert. Now, Job is poetry. There's a prose prologue. Prologue is just a big word for the stuff at the front. There's a prose epilogue, which is another big word for the stuff at the end. And in the middle is all poetry. The major part of the book is poetry, some 38 or 39 chapters of poetry in this book. And it's complex and extremely well-written poetry. We get the impression that by the time the book of Job was written, which I believe was during the lifetime of Job, that Hebrew poetry was already well understood, well developed, and well expanded for its use. There's all kinds of interesting problems with that we're not going to worry about. The literary value of the book of Job is acknowledged by everybody, scholars and laymen, Christians and non-Christians. The book is a magnificent story. Let's look at the purpose and the theme of the book. The dominant theme, what Job is about, what everybody knows about Job, is the question of righteous suffering. The question of why do bad things happen to good people? Because after all, bad things ought to happen to bad people. Bad things shouldn't happen to good people. Good people should have smooth sailing and nothing but no problems. Ask anybody you know who is a Christian if they've ever had trouble in their lives. And you'll discover that the idea that God rewards believers with easy lives is probably not accurate. The fact of the matter is, good people, righteous people, Christians, believers, do in fact suffer, and bad things regularly happen to good people. The classic argument for atheism goes something like this: uh, if uh, if God is uh, powerful, He could make suffering go away. If God was good, He wouldn't want anybody to suffer. So your God, your biblical God, is either not powerful, as you claim him to be, or he is not good, because everybody knows suffering happens. Uh, so we ask the question, why do bad things happen to good people? That's the dominant question of the book of Job, because as we walk through this thing, we're going to see it's fairly clear. Bad things happen to Job. Job runs into a terrible set of problems, the loss of virtually everything. And he wonders, and then his three friends wonder, and then a fourth friend critiques everybody and also provides a suggestion as to why good people have bad things happen to them. It's one of those conundrums that is important for us, for everybody really, to eventually deal with. And the book of Job is all about this. So there's some other purposes that happen along the way. As we get into the first chapter, we're going to see that we get a unique glimpse into Satan's relationship to God. Very strange. And it came about one of those days that the sons of God presented themselves before the Lord, and Satan was among them. So we ask ourselves, what is Satan doing amongst the sons of God? The sons of God here have to be the angels, and Satan has to be present in this meeting of the angels with God. So we've got to be scratching our heads here, wondering what is going on here that God is allowing Satan into His presence. It doesn't seem right. Something seems to be rather odd. Uh, the use of the term sons of God here in Job has its parallel back over in Genesis 6. We remember that God was really irritated when the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and they took of them any they wanted. Who are the sons of God in Genesis 6? Is it possible the sons of God in Genesis 6 are to be equated with the sons of God in Job 1? I think the answer is fairly obvious. I think it makes sense that they're referring to the same group, and that the sons of God in Genesis are the angels. That's the basis of the so-called angel view of Genesis 6. At any rate, we see Satan here. Secondly, the book of Job teaches the need for repentance of even the most righteous of men. So Job is a righteous man, and God even brags about the righteousness of Job. Yet by the end of the book of Job, Job himself has realized that even he needs to repent. So repentance is necessary even for righteous men, and a repentance of sin on an ongoing basis, a recognition of sin in our lives, is basic to godliness. There is no once for all cleanup going on here. We routinely need to ask God for forgiveness, and to go on. Okay. Thirdly, the book teaches a New Testament truth, very important truth, that afflictions, difficulties, trouble in our lives are frequently the chastening of a loving Father, rather than the expressions of uh, God's anger or retribution. God isn't necessarily punishing us. He is perhaps trying to get our attention. Perhaps he's uh, trying to provide consequences for our overlooking of him. There are a lot of possibilities, but it's almost never the case that God is judging us. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So when bad things happen to us, we should not immediately jump to the conclusion that God is judging us. No, not necessarily. Perhaps he's trying to get our attention. Uh, Job was perhaps developing an inflated sense of his own righteousness. And I think it's possible to be proud of your own humility. And Job was getting there. Uh, and God needed to do some correcting. Finally, and I think this is one of the most important concepts in the book, uh, Job teaches the fundamental truth that God's man is God's to command. Uh, to put it another way, if I belong to God, he can do what he wants with me. He doesn't have to ask my permission. If I've given my life to him, then I belong to him with all that that entails. And if God decides to introduce trouble in my life, why should I reject that or be angry about that if I'm willing to accept the good things that God gives? I'll accept salvation and eternity in heaven, but I'll be angry if God does anything to cross me along the way. Well, I don't think so. I don't think God gives us that option. We notice, one, that God never asked Job's permission in this test. And he never promises a reward. And I think even more important, and something I haven't noted here, God never explained himself to Job, at least not in the book. If Job wrote this book, then he figured it out at the end. But God doesn't explain himself. He doesn't ask permission. He doesn't promise a reward. He doesn't he doesn't ever tell us what's going on. Things just happen, and God has the right to do that. All right, we're going to look at the outline of Job itself. The outline of Job is actually fairly straightforward. In chapters 1 and 2, we've got a prologue. At the very end of the book, we've got an epilogue. And in between is a dialogue. So prologue, dialogue, epilogue. The prologue introduces us to Job himself, and we're told just right off the bat, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us where Uz was. We don't really know. We have to imply that from some other things. But there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now, all of those descriptions apply to godly people in general, and believers particularly. When we see this description, we're talking about a believer. Now there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. The term East is important there. It's the Hebrew word Arava. So Job was an Arab. He was a man of the East, a Midianite perhaps. Uh, it's hard to derive his ethnic background, but he was a man of the East. And in the picture here on your screen, there's a picture of Job taken by one of his sons, who had an early version of a digital camera, chiseled on stone. Yeah, difficult thing. No, this is actually a Bedouin man who's got his tent set up in the parking lot of the Good Samaritans Inn in in Israel. It's alongside the highway, and people would pull off on the side of the highway and sit down and meet him. He'd make coffee, stuff like that. Seems like we stopped and had coffee with him. And I have a picture of him someplace with Donna. Uh, but that's the kind of tent that Job would have lived in. This is a very traditional tent. The black is camel hair, and I've forgotten what they dye it with, but it's a black or dark brown tent, and they're quite heavy. That's why you need camels to carry these tents around. At any rate, there were born to him all these sons and daughters, thousands of sheep and camels. 3,000 camels is an awful lot of camels. There are arguments that the camel was not domesticated until the 8th century AD, but that's stupid. The camels have been around for thousands of years, and I'm not going to walk through that whole argument with you. The camels have been around for a long, long time, and they've been useful as beasts of burden in the desert, because they're so practical out there. They're great in the desert. I wouldn't want one particularly unless I lived in the desert. At any rate, he was a very, very wealthy man. He had a whole bunch of stuff, a lot of property. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day. Now, we don't know what that means exactly, presumably a birthday, but maybe not. They would take turns throwing feasts. The practice of feasting is an old one, and the sons uh, are as the heirs of Job would also be wealthy men in their own right. Uh, and they, as wealthy men, they would have their own households and their own uh, clans of servants and sheep and goats and all of the rest. Uh, so we're not talking children here. We're talking grown up, prosperous men of means who are the sons of Job. The daughters of Job would be uh, of lesser social importance in the ancient world. But every day or every feast day, they would throw a feast. They would send and invite their sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the day of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning, offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." And thus Job did continually. And so this is a description of a prosperous, happy family, a godly family. There's nothing wrong here. Some have said, well, look at this. They were eating and drinking. That surely that was sinful. I I don't know. I'm just done with lunch. I was eating and drinking at lunch, so I think this is normal, and I think these were good people, and bad things happen to them, including death, that uh, they didn't deserve. People who say that they did deserve this because somewhere deep down they must have done something wrong are missing the point. The point is, these are good people, these are prosperous people, these are godly people, and something really awful happened to them. Now, there was a day. Now we see the picture in heaven that starts at verse 6. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "Well, from going to and fro on the earth, looking up and down in it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him in the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." And Satan answered, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side?" And the answer to that is, of course, that God has put a hedge around him. God has been protecting Job. Job is a good man, and God has been involved by his providence in taking care of Job and providing the normal things. And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only don't stretch your hand out against him personally." So Satan went out and did that. Now, there was a day when the sons and daughters, Job's sons and daughters, were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and there came a messenger to Job that said, "The oxen were plowing, the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them, and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword." The Sabaeans, by the way, are the people from Sheba, which is to the south. This is one of the reasons we know where this is. The oxen there are actually cows, but don't worry about it for now. So the Sabaean struck them with the edge of the Lord. I alone have survived to tell the gruesome tale. And while he was yet speaking, here comes another. It's almost like stage notation. Uh, and from stage left, enter the second servant. Here he comes. While he was speaking, there came another who said, "The fire of God fell from heaven, burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell the tale." While he was still talking, here comes another, and he lines up with the other two, looking out toward the audience, and you can see them there on stage. It just works really well. The Chaldeans formed three groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell the tale. And then finally comes the last one. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came, struck the four corners of the house, which was a tent, of course, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell the tale. So Job has lost everything. He has lost his cows, his land. The Sabaeans have killed servants, the sheep, and the goats, and all of the stuff has been burned up and stolen. The camels are gone. He's lost it all, and all of his children are gone. It's a terrible day. So Job arose and tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground, and worshipped. There's that word worship. We talked about the concept of worship earlier in Genesis, and before that in the book of Romans. Worship is the enthusiastic, voluntary submission of all that I am to a God who is worthy of infinitely more. That's the concept of worship. And this concept of worship is present here. Worship is not merely a style of music. Worship is a submission of my life to God. When we join together in church to worship, what we're really doing is calling one another to worship. We're encouraging one another to worship. The worship itself is what I do with my life when I'm not being watched by all of my Christian friends. That's worship. So Job worshiped. Uh, he shaved his head, he fell on the ground and worshiped. And among other things, he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Very famous line and very true. And in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. So Job maintained his righteousness. He stayed above it all. This is the right reaction so far. So chapter 2 comes in, and we see again a scene in heaven. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Satan was among them. "Where have you been?" Satan answered, "Going to and fro." And the Lord said, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on the earth, blameless and upright," and so on. He still holds fast to his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. That's actually fairly important. Theologically, uh, Job never was told what was going on in heaven. That's above his pay grade, if you will. Job simply suffered the slings and arrows. He suffered what was happening, but the reason was never told to him. But God knew that there was no reason. Then Satan answered and said, "Skin for skin. A man will give all that he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand and touch his bone and flesh, he'll curse you to your face." The Lord said, "Okay, he's in your hand, only spare his life." So this time, Satan went out and afflicted Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Now that sounds miserable. Uh, the people who know things like this have uh, looked at the symptoms here. Sores all over the skin. Uh, there seems to be an itching. So Job was using a piece of broken pottery to scrape the sores to try to relieve the itching. And he was also in the ashes. Now, ashes contain a variety of chemicals. If you mix ashes with water, it forms a kind of a mud that you can put on your skin that will relieve the itching. And I'm not sure exactly what the chemistry is, but it's true. Uh, the uh, doctors who specialize in skin problems, dermatologists, have told us that Job's health problem is a thing called pemphigus foliaceus. And I won't make you memorize that, but we actually have a name for it. It involves uh, an autoimmune reaction. It's a virus that produces an autoimmune reaction that bubbles up to the surface of the skin, kind of like an awful thing that we sometimes see today called shingles. It's just this viral infection deep in the body that bubbles up through the skin and produces boils that break, and there's a pus that oozes out, and the smell, I'm told, is just awful. Well, particularly bad breath. Uh, People who would get close enough to Job to talk to him would notice that he had extraordinarily bad breath during this time. So people wonder, why did Job's friends stop 100 meters away? Well, maybe he just smelled bad. Uh, Job was in terrible trouble here. And this was a health problem that was quite serious. Usually, this is not something that is life threatening, but it is definitely very serious. Job's wife is introduced in verse 9. Uh, we don't see Job's wife much in this whole sequence, but what we do see of Job's wife is not very encouraging. His wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." Uh, okay, there's an old American comedian named Henny Youngman who used to use the line, "Take my wife, please." I, I, Job maybe should have cursed his wife and died. I don't know here. This is not a helpful thing for his wife to say. Curse God and die. But Job responds, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all of this, Job did not sin. So, thus far, Job is responding reasonably well. He's undergoing a really tough trial. And here comes Job's three comforters, his buddies, his friends. When Job's three friends, we're not told that Job had any more friends than this. Maybe it was a real small community, or maybe Job really wasn't as nice a guy as we're told. But he has three friends who heard all of the bad stuff that's happening, and they each, from his own place, came to visit Job. These were Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Nemathite. Okay, so Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And these three are going to be important as they're going to have a conversation with Job. And Job will speak, and then each of the three friends will speak. And we can organize this in a number of ways. And I'm not going to, you don't have to memorize this because you won't be taking a test. But Eliphaz and Bildad each get 3 speeches. Zophar only gets 2 speeches. I'm not sure why that is, but it's true. Zophar only goes Zophar. That's how I remembered it back in seminary. And Zophar is replaced in his last speech by a young theologian by the name of Eliphaz, or Elihu, sorry, who has not been introduced yet. He will be introduced in chapter 38. So Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they made an appointment together to come and show some sympathy. And when they saw him from a distance, they didn't recognize him. They raised their voices and wept. They tore their clothes. They sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. They sat with him on the ground for 7 days and nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Now, I'll give you a hint here. During the 7 days that the three friends were silent with Job, they did him the only good that they did their whole time. Generally speaking, the advice that the three friends gave to Job was worthless. Uh, the three friends simply didn't understand why Job was suffering. They tried to tell him why he was suffering and what he needed to do about it. But they were all wrong. They were wrong about the reason, and they were wrong about what Job needed to do. Job's responses to his friends uh, demonstrate an increasing depression on his part. The three friends actually did him a great deal of damage. while they were talking. The only good they did him was to simply be quiet. Many times when you're visiting with someone who has undergone a terrible problem, a loss of a loved one, a terrible accident, a financial disaster, there's lots of things that happen to good people. And when you go to be with them, don't ask, what is God teaching you in this time? Don't say, oh, you must have done something wrong, that God is punishing you. Terrible thing to say. Uh, have you discovered yet why God is doing it? They don't know, and you can't tell them. Often, uh, God sends trouble our way to give us an opportunity to grow. It's not because we sinned. So the three friends, here they go. So that's the prologue, and we discover that Job is suffering because God allowed Satan to reach out and harm him, to touch him in some awfully bad ways. And that leads us into a dialogue. If you ever are around Jewish people, you'll discover Jewish men particularly like to argue. I don't know if Jewish women do or not. I've never noticed, but in Israel, you'll often find a couple of Jewish men discussing something. And my modern Hebrew particularly, is not quite good enough to always follow the arguments. Uh, uh, you could tell that it's heated and it's theological. Everything is theological, and there's a heartfelt disagreement going on, and they're just having a wonderful time. These guys I shot in Jerusalem. Starting in chapter 3, Job starts up. We call this the first cycle, and we're going to see Job speak, and then Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Zophar, and Job. It'll finally end up. And then a second cycle with Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and with Job speaking in between, a third cycle. We'll do much the same. Let me do just a little bit of Job in chapter 3, beginning at verse 1. Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Okay. Uh, Usually you think fairly highly of your own birthday, and people celebrate with you. Job curses the day of his birth. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. And this goes on. Uh, uh, and Job is complaining about the awfulness of life, and is essentially saying that he wishes he had never been born. If those of you with teenagers at home may recognize that particular complaint. Oh, I wish I'd never been born. I wish you'd never had me. You're so mean to me, and because you're insisting that they eat their broccoli or whatever the issue might be. Eliphaz responds to this. As is Eliphaz the Temanite in 4 and verse 1. If one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? Yet who can keep from speaking? Behold, you've instructed many and have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who is stumbling and made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Verse 7, remember who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Okay, what is Eliphaz doing? He's saying, Job, you're suffering because you've done something wrong. That's the basic message of all three friends. You're suffering because you sinned somewhere along the way. You're obviously suffering, and Eliphaz says, my experience teaches me that sin leads to suffering. And when did you ever see righteous people suffering? Well, Eliphaz must not have been paying attention because righteous people do in fact suffer. And Job's response, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 6, is essentially, and this will be all of his responses, but I'm innocent. I haven't sinned. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm suffering for no need. In chapter 8, Bildad goes on. Now, Bildad, instead of looking at personal experience, the existential theologian of Eliphaz, Bildad is the historical traditionalist. He says, look at tradition, look at the background. Inquire of bygone ages, this is 8:8, and consider what the fathers have searched out. For we know that so on and so forth, that sin results in punishment, that you're suffering because you sinned. Job responds in chapter, let's see here, in chapter 9. Truly I know that it is so, but how can a man be right before God? Or literally, or another way of translating this perhaps, how can a man be just before God? If one wished to contend with him, one could not answer him once in 1,000 times. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who has hardened himself against him and succeeded? So who can contend with God? He commands it, and it is the way it is. Nobody can answer God. It is entirely possible that there is no intermediary. The words about the sealing up of the stars, who stretched out the heavens, verse 8, verse 9, who made the bear, which we in the West call the Big Dipper, and Orion, the hunter in the stars, the Pleiades. Isn't that interesting? The names for the stars go way back, and they were earliest recognized in the Arabian Peninsula, where Job lives, uh, and constellations like the Pleiades. Behold, he snatches away, and who can turn him back, and so on and so forth. So Job says, who can contend with God? He continues his plea in chapter 10. Then on into chapter 11, we see Zohar's first, or Zophar's first expense. He's the legalistic religious dogmatist. He says this is true because I say it's true, basically. So Eliphaz looks at experience. Bildad looks at history, and Zophar looks at religious dogma. And Zophar, verse 4. For you say, my doctrine is pure, I'm clean in God's eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for he is manifold in understanding. Know that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Oh, what an awful thing to say to somebody, especially somebody suffering through something really horrible like Job was at the time. Well, Job replies in chapters, actually in, chapters 12 to 14. No doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. Yeah, but he's getting mad, which is a good thing. But this goes on, speaks of God's wisdom, chapter 13. Is Job still expressing his hope. This is a great passage. Behold, my eye has seen all this, my ear has heard, 13:1. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you, but I would speak to the Almighty. I desire to argue my case with God. As for you, you whitewash with lies. Worthless physicians are you all. Oh, that you would keep silent, and it would be your wisdom. Matter of fact, it was their wisdom the first 7 days. Uh, verse 12, your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. In chapter 14, there's some famous passages, 14:1. Man who is born of woman is few of days and full of trouble. Yeah, that's one that made its way into the Book of Common Prayer that in the English language has become a part of funeral services. He comes out like a flower and withers. He flees like a shadow and continues not. Verse 7. He looks at the contrast. He says, a man is few of days and full of trouble, but there's hope for a tree. If a tree is cut down, it will sprout again, and its shoots will not cease. Okay, but when a man is cut down, it's all over. He just dies. At least if a tree gets cut down, has some terrible disaster, maybe it will grow back, but not so with a man. There is hope for a tree. Ah, what a thing. Eliphaz accuses Job a second time, and we see the beginning of the second cycle in chapter 15. Eliphaz is continuing his argument that Job is suffering because of his sin, and he's looking at experience again. Job replies in 16 and 17, and he starts again with miserable comforters are y'all. He's from the southern part of Arabia, apparently. Sorry about that. Americans would understand y'all. That's something that people say who live in the southern part of our country. The plural, miserable comforters are you all. And he goes on. Bildad then continues in chapter 18. Job replies. This is one of the more important passages in Job. Look at verses 25 and beyond. For I know that my Redeemer lives. The word Redeemer there is the same word that we find in the little book of Ruth. And a word that is used a number of times in the Pentateuch, is used routinely in the Psalms, also poetic literature, for the Messiah. The Redeemer is the one who pays the price to set someone free from slavery to sin. This is a very important word. I know that my Redeemer lives. I'm in 19 and verse 25. Donna was just asking me where I am. And at the last, he will stand upon the earth. That's a remarkable passage. The Redeemer, the kinsman Redeemer in the Old Testament, is one with the authority and the property to do the job of redeeming one from slavery, and also is the close enough relative that he can properly act as the Redeemer. In the book of Ruth, the kinsman Redeemer Boaz takes the young woman as as his bride in order to raise up an heir to the dead first husband's wife. It's to redeem the line. That's a great story. We'll get there when we get to the book of Ruth. But that same word is used here, and this has clearly messianic uh, points. I know that my Redeemer lives. And here Job uses the present tense. He is alive now. He has been alive. And I know that in the last, he will stand upon the earth. And the last there is in the last days. He will stand upon the earth. That's a reference to the first and the second comings of Christ. The Redeemer, the one who gives himself for salvation, will come once to die for sin and a second time to establish the eternal kingdom. This is the whole message of the Old Testament about our salvation. So here we are in the book that was probably the first book of the entire Bible to be committed to writing, and may not even have originally been written in Hebrew. It might have been edited into Hebrew. I don't know. And we have these lines. Then Job continues, and after my skin has been thus destroyed. Now, he has a terrible disease he thinks is probably fatal, where his skin is being destroyed. Really a rather awful thing. He says, after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. Job believes in a bodily resurrection. Whom I shall see myself, my eyes shall behold and not another. My heart faints within me. He is overwhelmed by the thought that in spite of his suffering, yet he will stand in the presence of the living God, alive and whole and well, in spite of his present suffering, because of his relationship with his Redeemer. In my way of thinking, Job has learned this from the revelation that's been passed down from Adam through Noah, the general revelation of one God in heaven and earth who provides a way for escape from sin through the Redeemer who is to come. That's the seed of the woman. This is a unified message of the whole Old Testament, looking forward to the gospel of the New Testament. And Job understands that. He has accepted that by God's grace, Job is a child of God in exactly the same way that you and I are. Well, Zophar speaks. This is his last message because, as you'll recall, Zophar only goes so far. Zophar the Naamanite responds, "Oh, don't you know that religious dogma teaches that you're a sinner?" Job replies, but the wicked do prosper in chapter 21. Then Eliphaz gets his last shot in chapter 22. He says, can a man be profitable to God? Surely he who is wise is profitable to himself. Is it any pleasure to the Almighty if you are in the right? Very strange thing to ask, but it comes from the dogma that that Eliphaz believed. Says it is for your fear of him that he reproves you. Okay, chapter 23, Job replies, but where is God? Oh, that I knew, verse 23:3. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know what he would answer me and understand what he would say. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? And so on. Job is asking here for God to show up, come to court. that we can have this final argument. Job continues in chapter 24. Then we have Bildad in chapter 25 very briefly. And Bildad answers or asks this very, very important question. How then can a man be right before God? How can a man be righteous before God? Now, Job has asked that question once earlier. Now, Bildad answers it. And his answer is a man can't be right before God. A man has to always work up to righteousness, and you suffer because of your unrighteousness. How can a man be right before God? How can he that is born of woman be pure? Behold, even the moon is not bright, the stars are not pure in his eyes. How much less man, who is a maggot, and the son of man, who is a worm? So Bildad's message is not very encouraging. Job, you're a worm, you're a maggot, like these things that are eating your flesh right now. Repent, Job, repent, because you're sinful. Well, Job's response is not encouraging. He says, I'm standing in my integrity, 27:5. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity. I hold fast to my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. Now, Job is simply being honest here. I think Job honestly believes that he has lived a righteous life. And by God's own testimony, Job is a godly man, a righteous man, an upright man who has walked in integrity. That's God's own testimony. And Job is simply repeating that. And yet, in repeating that, he is claiming something approaching perfection. And in claiming to be perfect before God, he is actually sinning. So the message of the three friends is, Job, you're suffering because you sin. We're now going to come to the message from I've got a long appeal from Job, but we're going to look at Elihu in chapter 32. Elihu goes from 32 to 37, and he critiques everybody. He says, you friends are wrong when you say, Job, you're suffering because you sinned. But Elihu says to Job, you are sinning with your pride because you are suffering. The suffering has happened, and now you're blaming God for this. You're complaining to God about suffering when you have no right to do that. Eventually, we're going to get to the conclusion of the whole story, which is in 38 to 41. God is going to respond to Job. In chapter 38, we get God's response. And the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. The famous line. Which whirlwind was that? I don't know. A tornado arrived, and Job got his answer. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird yourself for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. When I was in graduate school, I occasionally had to undergo an oral examination. I would appear before some professors. I would sit at a desk and they would ask questions until they were satisfied that I'd told them everything I knew. It was terrible. I always hated those. And it was like this: gird yourself like a man. We will ask questions and you will answer. Oh, so Job is getting a final exam here. And he starts right off with, so tell me, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? and Job's only answer can be, well, I. And God goes on. Verse 38 or chapter 38, 8. Who shut up the sea with doors when it burst from the womb? Verse 12. Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Who causes dawn to know its place? Verse 16. Perhaps you've entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep. Verse 28. Does the rain have a father? From whose womb came the ice? These are all questions that would be easy for God, but no man can possibly know. The end of chapter 39 into verse 40, the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it. And so Job says, I'll be quiet now. Behold, I am of small account, verse 4. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once, I will not answer. Twice, but I will not proceed. And the Lord proceeds to talk to Job. And now he, instead of talking about nature, he goes on to some rather mythological, magnificent animals, Behemoth and Leviathan. We don't know what those are. Some have suggested that Leviathan, at least, is a kind of symbol for Satan. It's entirely possible, and also very difficult. But at the end of all of this, chapter 42, Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, that to no purpose of yours, that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is it that bides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I've uttered what I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. There's the key. Chapter 42 takes us up to the very closing, and I've given you a picture of some little boys in Jerusalem to remind us that Job has still more children along the ways. Eliphaz and the others go away, and we see Job restored. The Lord restored. This is 42:10. All of Job's fortunes, twice as much as before. All his brothers and sisters came. They showed sympathy. The Lord blessed Job. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, so on and so forth. He had 7 sons and 3 more daughters. Nobody ever worries about the first 7 sons and daughters. They were believers. They went to heaven. But their lives were shortened. Yes, but they had good lives and they went to heaven. This is not a tragedy. Okay. And now he has 7 more sons and 3 more daughters and all this. And in all the land, there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters. And their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. And then after this, Job lived 140 years, saw sons, sons, and 4 generations, and Job died, an old man full of days. So, what do we learn from the book of Job? We learn, 1, that God has a purpose in our suffering, even if it's something we will never, ever understand. That God is the giver of all things good and not so good. That God's hand is at work in all these things. Romans 8:28. We know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who are the called according to his purpose. So God in his wisdom chose for chose for Job to have trouble. Job had a tough life. He had a tough time in life. And God understood that. He knew that going in. And he knew that the reason for that was so that his story could be told throughout all of the generations to come. And all of us can look and realize that God is at work even in our suffering, that the point of our suffering is that we learn to walk with God by faith, even when things are hard. That's it. That's it. Is God going to reward us with riches and prosperity? Not necessarily. Read the book of Job. Will the righteous always enjoy happy days? Not necessarily. Read the book of Job. So today, in the midst of this lockdown and this virus and the really hard economic times that all of us are going through and will go through in the months and probably couple of years to come, God is at work. God is working this. He is accomplishing for his own purposes that which will build our faith and by grace make us more like him. On what day is coming next? On Wednesday, we'll go on to the book of Exodus. Just what you thought came after Genesis. We'll go on to Exodus and we'll begin talking about the foundations of the nation of Israel itself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming out today. Thank you for picking this up on Facebook. I'm enjoying spending my time with you. I'm going to, let's see if I can make it all happen again here. I'm going to unmute everybody and go back to gallery view so I can see you all. It's been fun. Is the power back on there, Oscar?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
God bless you.
Hi,
Hi,
Donna.
Mike. Hi there.
Bye.
Yeah,
Good
I
night,
didn't see you
everyone.
there.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
guys. Bye-bye, everybody. Where's Dolly? I don't see Dolly. There's Dolly. Okay. Bye-bye, Sally. Bye-bye, Oscar.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
I'll keep looking for airplane for you. Blessings now. Bye-bye.
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 Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Buonanotte tutti. A domani.
Okay.
Domani.
God bless. Bye-bye.
God bless.